Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I found a night shift job on the deep web to work at a Korean hospital. They gave me a strange list of rules. Alright, so this might sound like complete BS, but I swear this is real. If you've ever been desperate for a job, you know the lengths you'll go to, right? I'd been unemployed for almost 6 months, and things were getting real tight. Rent was late, groceries were down to instant noodles, and I was starting to get that panicky feeling in my stomach every time my phone rang, knowing it could be another bill collector. I'd tried everything: job boards, Craigslist, even those sketchy gig apps. Nothing was working out. My friend, let's call him Mike, knew I was struggling. So one night, after a couple beers, he let it slip that he'd heard of a way to find high-paying gigs if you were willing to get a little creative. I'm talking about the deep web. Now, I'd always heard the stories about the deep web. Hitmen for hire, drug markets, and all that dark stuff. I wasn't exactly excited to dive into it, but Mike was adamant. He told me there was a site that sometimes posted jobs, real jobs, for people who were okay with working weird hours or doing stuff that didn't ask too many questions. I figured, what did I have to lose? Worst case scenario, I'd see some sketchy listings and leave. Mike showed me how to download the Tor browser and led me to a forum he'd used a couple of times. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. Weird classified ads for stuff I don't even want to think about. But then, one post caught my eye. Night shift position available at Korean hospital. No experience necessary. High pay. It seemed almost normal, except for the fact that it was buried on the deep web. There was no company name, no hospital name, just an email. The description was vague. It said something about needing people to help with administrative tasks at a hospital in a rural area of South Korea. They were looking for foreigners, which struck me as odd, but I figured maybe it had something to do with language barriers. The pay, though? It was insane. Enough to cover my rent for 3 months after just a week of work. I shot off an email, fully expecting to hear nothing back, but to my surprise, I got a reply the next day. It was short and to the point. Thank you for your interest. Your application is accepted. We will provide travel and accommodations. Please review the attached document carefully. If you agree to the terms, respond with, I accept. It was all way too quick and way too easy. No interview, no real details about the job. Just a PDF titled Rules and Guidelines.pdf attached to the email. I figured it wouldn't hurt to at least check it out, right? I opened the document, and the first thing that hit me was how clinical it sounded. Here's a taste of what it said. Rule 1. You must arrive at the hospital at exactly 8:45 p.m. No earlier, no later. Rule 2. Upon arrival, you'll be met by a staff member in a blue uniform. Do not speak to them unless they speak to you first. Rule 3. Do not, under any circumstances, enter room 311. Rule 4. If you hear knocking from inside room 311, ignore it. Do not acknowledge the sound. Rule 5. At 3:15 a.m., take the stairs to the 5th floor. There will be no lights, but proceed as if it's normal. Rule 6. If you see someone who looks like you in the reflection of any window, leave the floor immediately. There were more, but you get the idea. It was like a list of do's and don'ts for working in some kind of horror movie. The whole thing made me uncomfortable. but I couldn't shake the thought of that paycheck. Plus, maybe it was just some weird initiation thing, like how some jobs make you jump through hoops for the fun of it. I stared at the email for a good 20 minutes before finally typing, "I accept," and hitting send. Part of me felt like I was signing my life away, but the rational part of me was just hoping it was an easy gig and I could walk away with enough cash to get back on my feet. The response came instantly. "Pack for a week. Your flight is booked. Details will follow." And just like that, I was in. I woke up the next morning half convinced that I'd imagined the whole thing, but there it was, sitting in my inbox, a confirmation for a flight leaving in less than 24 hours, departing from LAX to Incheon, South Korea. A one-way ticket. I packed light, just the basics, figuring I'd grab anything I needed when I got there. Everything felt surreal, like I was floating through my own life. I didn't tell anyone about the job, mostly because I didn't want to deal with the "are you crazy?" reactions I knew would come. And yeah, maybe I was crazy. Who accepts a job through the deep web without even asking questions? But the money, that money had me hooked. The flight itself was uneventful, long, but not the longest I'd ever been on. I tried to distract myself with movies, but there was this growing sense of dread gnawing at me the closer we got to landing. I kept thinking about the list of rules, about room 311, about seeing my own reflection in a window that wasn't mine. But I kept telling myself it was just some kind of hazing. They probably gave everyone that list just to mess with them. We landed in Incheon at dusk. The airport was massive, sleek, all glass and steel. I didn't really have a plan for what came next. I'd been told I'd be met at the airport, but there were no details. No name, no contact info, nothing. As I stepped into the arrivals hall, I noticed a man standing near the back of the crowd, holding a sign with my name on it. He was dressed in a black suit, immaculately tailored, and didn't say a word when I walked up to him. He just nodded, turned, and led me to a car parked outside. The car wasn't a taxi or anything official looking. It was a nondescript black sedan, like the kind you'd see in a spy movie or something. The driver didn't talk to me, not even when I tried to make small talk about the long flight, just stared straight ahead. The drive was long, really long. We left the bright lights of the city behind pretty quickly, heading out into the countryside. The roads narrowed and twisted as we climbed into the mountains. The air got colder, and soon all I could see were thick forests on either side of the road, pressing in like dark walls. It was unsettling, but I was too tired to care. About 3 hours into the drive, I noticed something weird. There were no other cars. Like, none. No trucks, no taxis, no other travelers. Just us, winding our way through the mountains in total darkness. Even the road signs were in some kind of script I didn't recognize. It didn't look like the usual Korean characters I'd seen in the city. Finally, the car slowed and turned down an almost invisible road. We passed through a large rusted gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I saw the hospital before I even knew it was a hospital. It was old, like really old. The building was made of dark, weathered stone, and parts of it looked like they had been abandoned for decades. The only light came from a few dim windows, barely enough to illuminate the overgrown courtyard. The car stopped, and the driver gestured for me to get out. He didn't say a word. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and something else I couldn't quite place. It smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. like old blood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I tried to shrug it off. I grabbed my bag, and before I could even think to ask where to go, the car sped off into the night, leaving me standing there in the cold, alone. The front doors creaked open as I approached, but I didn't see anyone on the other side. Just a long, dimly lit corridor, lined with cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper. The place was definitely not what I expected for a working hospital. It looked more like something out of a forgotten war zone. Then I remembered rule number 2. I'll be met by a staff member in a blue uniform. Don't speak unless spoken to. So I waited. Minutes passed. No one came. I stood there, feeling more and more out of place, the silence pressing in around me like a living thing. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, or voices, or the hum of hospital machines, but there was nothing, just the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw someone. He stepped out of a shadow at the end of the hall, dressed in a blue uniform, just like the rules said. His face was blank, like there was no expression behind his eyes. He walked slowly towards me, stopping a few feet away. His skin was pale, almost gray in the dim light, and there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge me with a nod. He just stood there for a moment, staring past me, like I wasn't even there. Then, in one slow, mechanical motion, he raised his hand and pointed towards a door halfway down the hall. No words, no instructions, just that silent gesture. I glanced at the door, and that's when I saw the number on it, 311. My heart sank when I saw the number, 311. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, get out of there, forget about the money, and never look back. But there was something else, something pulling me toward that door, like I didn't have a choice. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the paycheck still hanging over my head, or maybe it was just the surrealness of the whole situation. Whatever it was, my feet started moving before my brain could catch up. I stopped right outside the door. The wood looked old, like it had been painted over 1,000 times. The brass doorknob was dull, worn, and slightly discolored, as if too many hands had gripped it over the years. But despite how ancient it looked, the door felt solid. The kind of door that kept things in, or kept things out. Don't enter room 311. That rule echoed in my head, louder than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. But I wasn't about to break the first real rule they gave me. Not yet, anyway. The guy in the blue uniform was still standing behind me, staring straight ahead, like I didn't exist. His lack of movement freaked me out more than I wanted to admit, so I turned away from the door and walked down the hall. My eyes kept darting back to room 311, even as I put distance between us. The rest of the hospital wasn't any better. Everything felt wrong. The walls seemed too close, the air too thick, like the whole building was pressing down on me. And the silence. It was too complete. I should have been hearing something. Footsteps, voices, the hum of fluorescent lights or machinery. But there was nothing. It was like the place had been abandoned years ago. Yet here I was, apparently working a night shift. After what felt like hours of wandering, I found a small room that looked like it had once been an office. It was tucked away behind the nurse's station, if you could even call it that anymore. The desk was bare, except for a dusty lamp, and a clipboard with papers so faded I couldn't make out any of the writing. I didn't care. I just needed to sit down and get my bearings. I took out my phone to check the time. 10:30 p.m. My shift had just started, and already I was losing it. The clock in the corner of the room was stuck at some random hour, its second hand twitching, but never actually moving forward. Then I remembered Rule 5. At 3:15 a.m., take the stairs to the 5th floor. There will be no lights, but proceed as if it's normal. I glanced at the stairs through the dirty window at the far end of the hallway. They looked like something out of a nightmare. Dark, steep, with crumbling steps leading up into the shadows. I told myself I'd cross that bridge when I got to it. For now, I just needed to focus on getting through the next few hours without losing my mind. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint at first, like the distant echo of footsteps. It started off subtle, almost like the creaking of old pipes or the building settling. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, closer. It was coming from the direction of room 311. My chest tightened. The rules flashed in my mind again, clear as day. If you hear knocking from room 311, ignore it. Do not acknowledge the sound. But this wasn't knocking. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was pacing just outside the door. I wanted to move, to leave, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I stayed frozen in the chair, staring at the open doorway, waiting for the footsteps to stop. But they didn't. They just kept coming. And then the sound changed. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was knocking. The first knock was so loud, it felt like it echoed inside my skull. Then came another, and another. Steady, rhythmic, like whoever or whatever was behind that door was trying to get my attention. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I tried to remember the rules. Do not acknowledge it. Do not go to room 311. The knocking didn't stop. It got louder, more urgent, like it was daring me to break the rule. Each knock rattled through the empty hallways, reverberating off the decaying walls. The sound became unbearable, like a hammer striking metal over and over again. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I held my breath, waiting for the next knock, but none came. Just the suffocating stillness of the hospital. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, though. The air felt heavier, like the very atmosphere had shifted. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At the end of the hallway, near the entrance to the stairs, something flickered in the dim light. I turned my head just in time to catch a glimpse of it, my reflection, but not in a mirror. It was in the window, and it was moving on its own. My breath caught in my throat as I watched my reflection take a step forward, staring back at me with a blank expression. But I wasn't moving. I was still frozen in my chair, too terrified to even blink. Yet the reflection, my reflection, was moving closer, walking toward me with an eerie, unnatural fluidity. I remembered Rule 6. If you see someone who looks like you in the reflection of any window, leave the floor immediately. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't even think. I just ran, down the hallway, past the silent rooms, and toward the stairwell. I didn't stop until I hit the stairs and started descending them, 2 at a time, my footsteps echoing through the darkness. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. By the time I reached the lobby, I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. The air down here was no better, thick and heavy, like a damp fog. I glanced at the old clock hanging above the reception desk. 12:45 a.m. I still had hours left in my shift, hours to survive. I don't know how long I stood there in the lobby, trying to calm my breathing, my mind racing. I kept replaying what had just happened, the footsteps, the knocking, that thing that looked like me in the reflection. The rules were clear. I did what they told me, but somehow I didn't feel any safer. If anything, I felt worse. Like this was just the beginning. There was a clock behind the reception desk, one of those ancient ones with the brass pendulum that swung back and forth like it was hypnotizing you. I watched the hands tick closer to 3 a.m. and my stomach dropped. Rule 5. At 3:15 a.m., take the stairs to the 5th floor. There will be no lights, but proceed as if it's normal. I kept checking my phone, hoping that time would slow down, but it didn't. Each minute dragged me closer to that moment I'd been dreading since I first read the rules. My mind was racing with questions. What was on the 5th floor? Why no lights? And why the hell was it normal to walk around in total darkness in this hospital? I thought about running, just leaving the hospital, walking until I found another town or some sign of life. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. I didn't know where I was, and even if I did, something told me this place wasn't one I could just walk away from. Then the clock struck 3 a.m. The lobby was still, silent. Every creak, every groan from the building felt magnified. The lights overhead flickered once, then settled back into a dim, sickly yellow glow. I waited, counting down the minutes, the tension building inside me like a coiled spring, and finally, it was time. 3:15 a.m. I stood up and made my way toward the stairs. The door to the stairwell groaned as I pushed it open, the air inside cooler and somehow thicker than the rest of the hospital. My footsteps echoed off the concrete steps as I climbed, the dim light from my phone barely cutting through the darkness. The higher I went, the more suffocating the air became. It was like the walls were closing in, pressing against me. I tried to focus on the rules, proceed as if it's normal, as if this was just another night shift, another job. But it wasn't. When I reached the 5th floor, the temperature dropped. Not like a normal cold though. This was bone deep, the kind of cold that clung to your skin and settled in your chest. And, just like the rules said, there were no lights. The only thing I could see was the faint glow from my phone, illuminating the stairwell door in front of me. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, and the moment I touched it, a strange sensation washed over me, like static, crawling up my arms and into my skull. The door opened into total darkness. I couldn't see anything beyond the narrow beam of light from my phone. The hallway stretched ahead of me, the walls barely visible. There were no windows, no sounds, just the low hum of the phone in my hand. I stepped inside, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the linoleum floor. The air felt wrong here, heavier, stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years. And then, as if on cue, my phone screen flickered once and died. Complete darkness. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give out. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I fought the overwhelming urge to scream. I fumbled with the phone, desperately trying to turn it back on, but nothing worked. The battery was full when I started, and now it was completely dead. I was plunged into absolute blackness, but I couldn't stop. The rules were clear. Proceed as if it's normal. I took a shaky breath and started walking forward, my hands outstretched in front of me, feeling for the walls. My footsteps were slow, measured, but with each step, The silence grew heavier, more oppressive. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any hint of movement, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. And then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped, my heart lurching in my chest, but the sound continued, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Proceed as if it's normal. I kept moving forward, my hands shaking as I groped blindly in the dark. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. Right in front of me. I froze. I could feel it now. The presence, whatever was standing there, just inches away, watching me in the dark. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Then something cold brushed against my arm. It was light, like the edge of a fingertip, but it was enough. I jerked back, stumbling, nearly falling, as I backed away from whatever had touched me. My hand slammed against the wall, and for a split second, I felt the icy sensation crawl across my skin again, this time on the back of my neck. I don't know how, but I managed to keep walking. Each step felt like I was moving through molasses, the air thick with tension. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, but the rules kept playing over and over in my head. Proceed as if it's normal. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I finally saw it. A faint, flickering light ahead of me. It was weak, like a dying candle, but it was enough to guide me forward. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from the nurse's station at the end of the hall. The flickering glow cast long, warped shadows across the floor, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to that light. The moment I reached the station, the light snapped off, plunging me back into darkness. But before I could even process what had happened, something else caught my attention. A door creaked open. Behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. I knew. Room 311. The door had opened, and something was waiting for me inside. The creaking door echoed down the hall, stretching the silence until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like my ribs might shatter. I didn't want to look back, but I knew that the door to room 311 was open now, and whatever was inside, it was no longer content to stay hidden. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone. The cold air wrapped around me, pressing in, making it harder and harder to breathe. My back was to the door, but I could feel it. Something watching me from that black void, waiting for me to turn around, waiting for me to make the mistake. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus, trying to breathe. The rules were clear. Don't enter room 311. Ignore the knocking. But there was no more knocking. Now the door was open, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But where could I go? That's when I remembered the final rule I hadn't yet faced. If you hear someone call your name, do not respond. Do not look at them. The thought made my blood turn to ice. I wasn't safe. Not even now. Not anywhere. The hospital, the rules. It was all a trap, and I'd walked right into it. And then it happened. From the darkness behind me, from inside room 311, I heard it. A voice, soft, familiar, like it belonged to someone I knew. But that was impossible. No one knew I was here. David, my name. It whispered through the silence, like a knife cutting through cloth, and it sounded just like my mother's voice. My knees buckled. and I grabbed the edge of the nurse's station for support. There was no way. It wasn't her. It couldn't be her. She was thousands of miles away, and yet the voice, it was perfect. The cadence, the tone, everything. "David, come here, please." The voice came again, and this time it was closer. So close, I could almost feel her breath on the back of my neck. The way she said it, though, pleading, like something terrible was about to happen if I didn't turn around. I clenched my fists, my knuckles white. My throat was tight, the air in my lungs refusing to leave. I knew I couldn't turn around. I knew it was a trick, but my body was screaming to look, to see. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remember the rules. If you hear someone call your name, do not respond. Do not look at them. So I didn't. But the voice didn't stop. It called again and again, each time more desperate, more familiar. First, it was my mother. Then my best friend from back home. Then someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. But the sound of their voice made my stomach churn, made my skin crawl with fear. I stood there, frozen in the dark, with my back to room 311, and listened as the voices changed, morphing, each one more disturbing than the last, each one more insistent, each one claiming to know me, to need me. "David, help us." The voice that said it sounded broken, like it came from a throat that had screamed itself raw. And in that moment, I realized something. The voices were waiting for me to break. They were feeding off my fear, growing stronger the longer I stood there, paralyzed. They were trying to make me doubt myself, trying to make me doubt the rules. But I didn't move. Seconds ticked by, stretching into minutes, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. I just knew I had to keep standing there, keep resisting the urge to turn around, no matter how much I wanted to. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. I was plunged into a silence so complete, it felt suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. My head was spinning, my legs shaking beneath me, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk room 311 anymore. I had to get out of the hospital. I had to leave. Slowly, I turned away from the nurse's station, away from the hallway, and toward the stairwell. I kept my eyes down, my steps careful, fighting the urge to look back over my shoulder. But the silence was so loud, so oppressive, that I half expected to feel cold hands wrap around my neck at any second. I reached the stairwell door and yanked it open, practically throwing myself inside. The door slammed behind me with a deafening bang, and for a second, I thought I heard footsteps rushing toward it from the hall. But when I looked through the tiny window in the door, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty hallway. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I could, not stopping, not thinking, just moving. I don't even know how I made it to the ground floor without falling. By the time I reached the lobby, I was drenched in cold sweat, my heart still pounding, but I wasn't about to slow down. The main doors were still open, just like they had been when I arrived, and I ran through them, out into the freezing night air. I didn't stop running until I was outside the gate, standing in the overgrown courtyard, staring back at the hospital. The building loomed in the darkness, quiet, its windows like dead eyes staring back at me. Nothing followed me out. Nothing tried to stop me. But the silence felt wrong, like the hospital was still watching, still waiting. I looked around, hoping to see the car that had dropped me off. But there was nothing, just the cold, empty night and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. For hours, I wandered through the dark countryside, not knowing where I was going, but needing to get as far away from that place as possible. I didn't stop walking until I found a small town at dawn. The locals didn't speak much English, but they understood enough to help me get back to the city. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to leave that place behind. But even now, after everything, I still have nightmares. Nightmares about room 311, about the voices, about the rules I almost broke. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it. The knocking. I'll be lying in bed, half asleep, and I'll hear it. 3 soft taps, as if someone's waiting just outside my door, waiting for me to answer. I read horror story on the deep web for fun. There was one tittle. Nothing that downs in our river ever truly stays dead. I now know why my grandma is 133 years old. All right, I know how this sounds already. Deep web, horror stories. Grandma is 133 years old. Dude, you're making this up. But hear me out. I thought the same thing when it all started. Trust me, if I could go back to that night and slap some sense into my past self, I would. But I guess when you're knee-deep in Reddit threads and creepy YouTube rabbit holes, your brain gets used to brushing off weird stuff. Like, oh, just another creepypasta. But this one got under my skin in ways I can't even explain. So, here's how it went down. I'm kind of a horror junkie, like the type of guy who spends hours reading through r/n/sleep, binging analog horror videos, and finding every excuse to freak myself out. It started innocent enough. A little adrenaline boost before bed, right? But I started getting bored of the usual stuff. Every haunted house story just started to sound the same. Every I found this weird tape narrative? Predictable. So I started going deeper, like really deep. And then I found the deep web. Now, before you roll your eyes, I know what you're thinking. Everyone and their grandma has heard the warnings about it. Don't go there. It's sketchy. It's illegal. And yeah, some of it is straight up horrifying. But I was just there for the creepy stories, the kind you don't find on the surface web. I wasn't buying illegal stuff or hacking into government databases, just hunting for the next scare. I remember the night I found the forum. It was one of those grimy, low-traffic sites that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2002. The banner at the top was a stretched, pixelated skull with eyes that seemed a little too lifelike. There were only a few threads, and they were all titled things like Tales from the Unseen or Stories Only the Lost Should Hear. Edgy, right? It was the kind of stuff that tries too hard to freak you out. But one title stood out. It was buried deep, with 0 comments, just sitting there at the bottom of the page. Nothing that drowns in our river ever truly stays dead. Now, that was intriguing. It didn't have the usual in-your-face shock value. It was subtle, like it was daring me to click on it. I'll admit, I hesitated for a second. The page had this old, grainy look, and I half expected it to crash my laptop when I clicked. But nothing happened. The page loaded, slow as hell. But there it was. One big block of text. No pictures, no usernames. Just the story. It started like this. The river in our town has a secret. It's not deep. It's not wide. But it's been around longer than anyone can remember. My grandma says it whispers if you listen close enough. And what it whispers, well, that's what I'm here to tell you. All right, I'll admit it. The story had me hooked from the first line. It had that small town folklore vibe. like those weird tales that always end with someone vanishing or something terrible happening. But what really gave me chills was the way it described the river. The author didn't give away where this town was, but it sounded so real, so familiar. The way they talked about their grandma, their family's history with the river, it was unsettlingly personal. The writer went on to describe how the river wasn't just a place people avoided, it was practically off limits. Their family had lived near it for generations, and everyone knew the unspoken rule: don't go in the water, especially don't go near it at night. It wasn't because the river was dangerous, at least not in the traditional sense. There were no currents or undertows, no hidden rocks, but anyone who went into the river, anyone who drowned, they never really left. Their bodies would show up downstream eventually, but something about them was always off. People would whisper that their eyes were too wide open, or that their skin had a strange waxy sheen. It was the kind of thing people in town didn't talk about, but everyone knew. The writer mentioned how their own great-grandfather had gone missing in that river back in 1921. He'd been fishing at dusk right on the riverbank and just vanished. They found his body a week later, bloated and tangled in reeds, but when the family tried to bury him, his casket wouldn't stay underground. I stopped for a second there. What did they mean? Wouldn't stay underground? I thought maybe it was a typo or just bad writing, but the story got worse, so much worse. They talked about how the casket would appear back at the riverbank, like someone had dug it up and left it there overnight. They tried burying him again, this time deeper, but the same thing happened, over and over, until the family gave up. I thought this was where the story would end, some spooky little ghost tale about a haunted river. But then it got really weird. The writer said that a month after they gave up trying to bury their great-grandfather, he showed up at their front door, alive. Well, alive isn't the right word. He was standing there, but he wasn't him. His face looked right. His clothes were the same ones he'd been buried in, but there was something inhuman about him, like he was moving in slow motion. He didn't speak. He just stood on the porch, staring into the house. The grandma, who was just a little girl at the time, said that when she looked into his eyes, it was like he wasn't really looking at her, like he was looking through her. That's when I felt it, that little chill at the back of your neck, like someone standing just a bit too close behind you. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, but of course, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. The air felt thicker, heavier. I went back to reading. The writer said that from that night on, the family lived in fear of their great-grandfather. He never came into the house, just stayed on the porch, sometimes for hours, sometimes all night. No one dared approach him. They didn't call the police. Who would believe them? It didn't stop there. Over the years, more family members drowned in the river. Some were accidents, some not so much. But they all came back, and they always came back wrong. And that's when the story dropped its final bombshell. The writer's grandma, she was still alive. She was 133 years old, and she hadn't aged a day since the day she drowned. That's when I stopped reading. Something about the way the story described her being preserved sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just that. It was because it reminded me of my own grandma. And that's when I realized I hadn't heard from her in months. I don't know what it was about that last part, but something snapped in my brain. My grandma had been old for as long as I could remember. Like, she had that timeless kind of grandma look. You know the kind. Wrinkled, silver hair tied up in a bun, but still oddly full of energy. When I was a kid, she used to chase me around the yard with a cane like she didn't need it. And yeah, she was old, seriously old, but she wasn't frail like other grandmas her age. She'd never been sick, not even a cold, and for the longest time, I thought she was just lucky. But after reading that story, I started feeling like I'd been missing something. I shook it off at first. I mean, 133 years old. That's insane. I was being paranoid, right? I had to be. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I realized I hadn't actually seen her in a while. Sure, we'd talk on the phone occasionally, but it was always brief. Just her checking in to see how I was doing, making sure I wasn't getting into trouble. But it had been months. That's when I started going down the rabbit hole. I called her the next day. No answer. Weird, but not alarming. She lived out in the country, kind of in the middle of nowhere, so maybe her phone was dead or something. I figured I'd give it a day and try again. But after 3 days of no response, I started getting anxious. I called my mum, who lives in another state, and asked if she had heard from Grandma lately. No, honey, but you know how she is. She's probably just out in the garden or reading those old books she loves. Yeah, maybe. But my gut was telling me something was off. I don't know how to explain it. It was like I couldn't get the story out of my head. The way the writer had described their great-grandfather just standing on the porch, it was so vivid. And the part about the grandma being impossibly old, alive, but not quite alive, that had stuck with me. I decided to drive out to her house that weekend. It's about a 2-hour trip from where I live, and honestly, the drive itself didn't help calm my nerves. The closer I got to her place, the more isolated the roads became. Trees started crowding the road, and the sky was this heavy, overcast gray that made everything feel suffocating. I don't know if you've ever driven out in the country like that, but it's a special kind of quiet, almost too quiet, like nature itself is holding its breath. When I pulled up to Grandma's house, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. The house was still standing. Her old pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and the garden looked like it had been recently tended. But there was this stillness. No birds, no wind, just this eerie silence hanging over the place. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I started to get that prickling feeling in the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But when I turned around, the yard was empty. I let myself in. The door wasn't locked, and that was already weird because Grandma was the type to triple-check locks. I stepped inside and called out her name. The house smelled the same, like dried lavender and old books. But the air was stale, like no one had opened a window in weeks. I checked the living room, the kitchen, the tiny den where she kept all her antiques and weird trinkets from yard sales. No sign of her. Then I made my way down the hall toward her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and for some reason, my heart was pounding in my chest. I wasn't even sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe she had just gone out for groceries, right? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I pushed the door open, the first thing I noticed was the bed. It was perfectly made, not a wrinkle in the blankets. Her cane was leaning against the nightstand. Everything looked untouched. But there was something odd about the air in that room. It was colder, like noticeably colder than the rest of the house. I walked over to the window, trying to figure out if maybe she'd left it open and that's why it was so chilly, but the window was shut tight. I turned back toward the bed and noticed something I hadn't before. There, lying on her pillow, was a single, long strand of silver hair. It was strange. Too perfect. Too out of place. I picked it up and felt a shiver run through me. It was like a piece of her had been left behind, but not in the normal way. Something about that strand of hair didn't feel right. It was cold to the touch, almost like it had been sitting in the freezer. I called out for her again, louder this time. The silence in the house was suffocating. My own voice echoed back at me, making me feel more alone than ever. But then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like floorboards shifting under someone's weight. I froze. The sound was coming from down the hall, Grandma's old rocking chair. I slowly backed out of the bedroom, my heart racing. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know. I had to see for myself. I had to check the rocking chair. I inched my way back down the hall, toward the den where she kept it. The door was open just a crack, but I could hear that creaking noise, slow and rhythmic, like someone was gently rocking back and forth. I pushed the door open. The chair was moving, empty, just rocking back and forth on its own, like someone had just gotten up from it. My skin crawled, and I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I noticed something else. On the floor, just beneath the chair, was a muddy footprint, not a fresh one, but an old, dried mark that had soaked into the wood. It was small, like a child's, but there was something odd about it. The toes weren't human. They were longer, stretched out unnaturally, like claws. I stumbled back, knocking over a vase as I scrambled to leave the room. My mind was racing. None of this made sense. Was I losing it? Was this just my imagination getting the better of me after reading that story? But then, from behind me, I heard a voice. "Come sit with me." It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was my grandma's voice, but it wasn't coming from the chair. It was coming from the basement. The basement she hadn't opened in years. The moment I heard her voice, my blood ran cold. It was the same voice I'd known my entire life, but it had this strange echo to it, like it wasn't quite hers, like something was trying too hard to sound like her. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something about that voice, it pulled at me. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like I had to know. I turned, staring at the door to the basement. That door had always been off limits. My grandma never said why. She just had a way of changing the subject whenever I asked about it as a kid. The one time I tried to sneak down there, she caught me halfway through the door and yanked me back so hard I nearly fell. The look in her eyes was enough to make sure I never asked again. Now, standing there, the door was slightly cracked open. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but it wasn't locked anymore. The old brass knob gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the hinges were slightly rusted, as if the door hadn't been touched in years. I felt my feet moving toward it before I even made the conscious decision to go. I swallowed hard, calling out, "Grandma?" Nothing. Just that thick, suffocating silence again. I pushed the door open all the way. The basement stairs descended into darkness, the kind of darkness that felt alive. Too deep, too consuming. The air coming up from the basement was freezing, colder than anywhere else in the house. It smelled damp, like something had been left to rot down there for decades. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the pitch black, trying to convince myself this was all just in my head, that maybe I was being paranoid, that the story I read was just some dumb internet fiction messing with me. But then I heard it again. "Come sit with me." The voice was clearer this time, closer, and it was definitely coming from the basement. My hands were shaking, but I took the first step. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, each step groaning like they hadn't been touched in ages. The air grew colder the further down I went, and I had to use the wall to steady myself. It felt like the darkness was closing in on me, swallowing me whole. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the thick blackness, revealing dusty walls lined with shelves of old, forgotten things. Jars filled with what looked like pickled vegetables, old books with cracked spines, and stacks of yellowed papers that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But there was something else, an odd scratching sound, like something moving, barely audible, over the creaking of the old house settling above me. I stepped off the last stair, the concrete floor freezing under my shoes. The flashlight flickered, just for a second, and my breath hitched. My hand shook as I swept the light across the basement. There was an old wooden rocking chair in the corner, identical to the one upstairs. But this one, it looked ancient, like it had been forgotten down here for 100 years. And there was someone in it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure was slumped over, head tilted forward, their hands resting in their lap. My heart jumped into my throat. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure slowly lifted its head. It was her. But it wasn't. Her face was pale, almost grey, her skin tight and waxy, like it had been stretched too thin over her bones. Her eyes, God, her eyes were wide open, but they didn't look at me. They were dull, clouded over, like she wasn't really seeing anything at all. Her mouth hung slightly open, her lips cracked and dry, but I swear I saw her chest move, like she was breathing. I took a step back, my legs trembling. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of twisted nightmare. "Grandma," I said again, louder this time, but the word felt heavy in the air, like it wasn't supposed to be spoken in that room. She didn't respond, but her eyes, they moved, just slightly, like they were focusing on something just behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam cutting across the basement. Nothing, just shadows stretching across the walls. But when I turned back to her, something had changed. The rocking chair was moving, slowly, back and forth, creaking with every movement. She hadn't moved herself, but something was moving her. "Come sit with me," she whispered again, her lips barely moving. My skin crawled. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I stumbled back toward the stairs, but before I could reach them, I noticed something else. Something I hadn't seen before, half hidden in the shadows. There was a door, a small, rusted metal door, tucked away in the far corner of the basement. It looked ancient, covered in thick black grime and overgrown with cobwebs, and there was something carved into the wood around it. Symbols, old and crude, like something you'd see scratched into a tree by a kid. Except these didn't feel innocent. They felt wrong. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a thin, cold draft seep out. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what was behind that door, but something deep inside me knew I wasn't supposed to open it. But that same voice, my grandma's voice, was whispering in the back of my mind. "Come closer. It's okay." I shook my head, stepping back, my hand still gripping the flashlight so hard I thought it might break. I had to get out of there. Now. But as I turned to leave, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. A hand, thin, skeletal, with long claw-like fingers, was reaching out from under the stairs, clutching my leg with an iron grip. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with deep, dark veins running through it, like the roots of a dying tree. I tried to scream, but my voice got caught in my throat. I kicked, trying to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling me down. My flashlight fell from my hand, the beam flickering out as it hit the floor. And then, through the darkness, I heard her voice, one last time. "Nothing that drowns in our river ever truly stays dead." The hand yanked hard, and everything went black. I woke up on the floor of the basement, the flashlight still flickering beside me. My head was pounding, and my ankle throbbed where the hand had grabbed me. But when I looked around, there was no one there. The rocking chair was empty, the figure gone, and the door. It was still ajar, just enough to taunt me. I scrambled to my feet, half limping, half crawling, back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the cold night air burning my lungs. Something was wrong with Grandma. Something had always been wrong. But now, I knew it had something to do with that river. That cursed river she'd always told me to stay away from. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand, those long clawed fingers wrapping around my ankle, the grip so tight I could still feel it hours later. My mind was racing, replaying everything I'd seen in the basement, everything that didn't make sense. The worst part, Grandma was missing, gone. The house was empty, and no matter how much I wanted to believe she was just out on some errand, I knew deep down that wasn't true. I had felt her presence down there, or something that looked like her anyway, but I couldn't stay in that house. I grabbed my car keys and left as soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, my hand still shaking as I turned the ignition. I didn't even have a plan. I just knew I had to get out. The drive back was a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every shadow that flickered on the road, every car I passed, I was convinced something was watching me, following me. That feeling of being chased, it never left. When I got home, I did what anyone would probably do. I tried to make sense of it. I scoured the internet, looking for anything that might explain what I had seen. I searched local legends, superstitions, anything that could connect this all to Grandma and that damn river. But I came up with nothing. It was like the river didn't exist. Not in any local history books, not even on Google Maps. It was just this forgotten, nameless place, out in the woods. But then I remembered something from the story I'd read on the deep web, the part about how the townspeople never talked about the river, how it wasn't in any official records. The town itself wasn't even mentioned by name. It was as if the river didn't want to be found. That's when I knew where I had to go. The river. It sounded insane, even to me. But something was pulling me there, like a thread I couldn't stop following. I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and a flashlight, just in case, and headed back out. The drive to Grandma's town felt longer this time, more oppressive. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the air was thick with the kind of humidity that makes it feel like a storm's about to break at any second. When I arrived back at her house, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The door was still locked from the outside, the windows still dark, but I didn't bother going inside. I wasn't there for the house. I was there for the river. It took me a while to find it. Grandma had always been vague about where it was. She'd only ever warned me to stay away from it, but she never said exactly how to get there. But I remembered something from when I was a kid. This overgrown path that wound through the woods behind her garden. She used to tell me not to play back there, that the woods were dangerous, but now I wondered if it was really the woods she was afraid of, or what lay beyond them. I followed the path, pushing through the thick brush, the ground soft and muddy beneath my feet. The trees grew denser the further I went, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. And then finally, I heard it. Water. The sound was faint at first, just a soft trickle in the distance. But the closer I got, the louder it became, until I could hear the rush of the river flowing somewhere just ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to pull me back. Then I saw it. The river. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet wide, shallow in some places, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The water was murky, a deep, almost black shade, and it moved unnaturally slow, like it was reluctant to go anywhere. The banks were overgrown with reeds and moss, the earth around them dark and wet. It looked ancient, like it had been there long before anyone had even thought to build a town nearby. And there, at the edge of the riverbank, I saw something else. A gravestone. It was small, barely noticeable, under the thick brush that had grown over it. The stone was weathered and cracked, the name on it almost completely faded. But I didn't need to see the name to know who it belonged to. My stomach turned as I crouched down, brushing away the moss. Great-grandfather, the man from the story, the man who had drowned in the river. I stood there frozen, staring at the gravestone like it might suddenly start speaking to me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. The water. It rippled, just slightly. At first, I thought it was a fish, or maybe a branch falling into the current. But then the ripples got stronger, spreading out across the surface of the water in slow, rhythmic waves. And then I saw the hand. It was pale, barely visible beneath the murky water, but it was there, rising up slowly, like something was pulling itself out from beneath the surface. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The hand reached further, followed by an arm, the skin bloated and gray, water dripping from it as it moved with a disturbing, unnatural grace. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the mud. My eyes were glued to the figure emerging from the river, but it wasn't just one. More hands, more figures, began rising from the water, their movements slow and deliberate, like they'd been waiting for this moment. I wanted to run. I should have run. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot, watching in horror as they emerged, one after another. Men, women, children, all with that same vacant expression, their eyes dull and lifeless, their skin sagging and waterlogged. Then I saw her. Grandma. She was standing at the water's edge, her clothes soaked, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands around her face. Her eyes locked onto mine, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no emotion, just emptiness. She stepped toward me, her feet sinking into the mud with each step, and that's when I realized the others were following her. The dead. All of them, their bodies grotesque and twisted from years of decay, but still moving, still walking toward me. My body finally reacted, and I turned, sprinting back down the path, the sound of splashing water and squelching mud growing louder behind me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was chasing me. I burst out of the woods, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I stumbled back to the car, fumbling with the keys as my hands trembled uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get the door open and slammed it shut behind me, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. I looked out the window, back toward the path. There was nothing there. No figures, no river, just the quiet, empty woods. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing added up. The story, the river, Grandma, none of it made any sense. But I knew one thing for sure. Something had been waiting in that river, and now it was coming for me. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The woods behind me were still, eerily quiet, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I could still feel them, those eyes, watching, waiting. Grandma, or whatever she had become, was gone now, but I couldn't shake the image of her waterlogged face. It was burned into my brain, her empty eyes staring through me like I wasn't even there. I had escaped the river, but something told me it wasn't over, not by a long shot. I finally started the car, the engine roaring to life, but the sound didn't make me feel any safer. The road ahead felt endless as I drove, my mind racing faster than the wheels on the pavement. I didn't have a plan. Where was I supposed to go? Who could I tell about this without sounding like I'd lost my mind? I tried calling my mom again, but she didn't pick up. I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if she knew more than she was letting on. Had she always known about Grandma, about the river? She had grown up here too, after all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I told her, it would somehow make everything worse, like saying it out loud would give the river more power, make it spread. The sun was setting by the time I got back home. The shadows were long, stretching across my driveway, like claws reaching for me. I locked every door, every window, pulling the curtains tight to block out the outside world. But even in the safety of my own house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. I knew they were still out there, whatever they were. And I knew that the river had marked me somehow. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. It was like something had latched onto me the moment I left the woods, and it wasn't letting go. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the drowned, the way they had emerged from the water, moving slowly, deliberately. And Grandma, she had led them. She had been one of them. No, she had been worse than them. I didn't go to work the next day. I didn't even leave the house. I couldn't. The thought of going outside, of stepping into the world, felt like walking into a trap. So I stayed inside, trying to make sense of it all. I went back online, desperate to find anything that could explain what was happening. But no matter how deep I dug, there was nothing. The story I had read on the deep web was gone, wiped from the forum like it had never existed. I tried to reach out to the forum's admin, but there was no response. The site itself felt like it had gone dead overnight, the kind of thing that just vanishes into the ether without a trace. It was like the story had been erased, but I knew it was real. And then the knocking started. It was late, past midnight. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, trying to distract myself with something, anything, when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock at the front door. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. 3 slow knocks. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone should have been at my door this late. My street was quiet, and I hadn't seen or heard a car pull up. I got up, creeping toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. Knock, knock, knock. I looked through the peephole, expecting the worst, but there was nothing. Just the empty front porch, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlight. I stood there for a long moment, staring, my mind racing. Was it just some neighborhood kid messing with me? Or was it something else? Something from the river. Then, as I started to turn away, I heard it. Come sit with me. My blood turned to ice. It was Grandma's voice, but muffled, distant, like it was coming from the other side of the door, or maybe even underneath it. My hand shook as I backed away from the door, stumbling into the living room, my mind screaming at me to leave the house, to run. But where could I go? They would follow me. I knew it. Whatever had come out of that river, it wasn't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. The knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like something wanted in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I dialed 911. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then finally, a voice picked up. But it wasn't the operator. It was my grandma. Come sit with me. I dropped the phone, the voice echoing through the empty house. There was no way this was happening. No way any of this was real. But as I stood there, I heard the door slowly creak open behind me. I turned, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might stop. The door was wide open now, and the cold night air was pouring in, but there was no one there, just the darkness. The porch was empty, the street was empty, and then I saw it, a single wet footprint on the hardwood floor, followed by another, and another. They were coming into the house. I backed up, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The footprints kept appearing, moving closer, but I couldn't see what was making them. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, Grandma, standing in the hallway, soaked, her hair matted and dripping, her clothes clinging to her body like she'd just walked out of the river. Her skin was pale, her eyes dull and lifeless, but she was smiling. That same cold, empty smile she'd had when I saw her in the basement. I told you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the dripping water. Nothing that drowns in our river ever stays dead. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could only watch as she took a step toward me, the water pooling around her feet, her hands outstretched. Come sit with me, she said again, her voice soft and hollow. It's time to go back. I didn't wait. I ran, straight out the back door, through the yard, not stopping until I was in my car, speeding down the road as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But now I know. The river wasn't just some old story, some local legend to scare kids. It was real. It took people. It kept them. And it brought them back, but not as they were, as something else, something hollow. And now it's coming for me. I don't know how much longer I have. I've left town, driven halfway across the country, but I can still feel it. Them following me. I hear her voice in my dreams, whispering, calling me back to the river. I don't think I can run forever. Eventually, the The river gets everyone. I ordered sunlight of the deep web. It was great until my wife started acting funny. Okay, so this is going to sound insane, but hear me out. This all started about 3 months ago when I was messing around on the deep web. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bad idea. And yeah, you're totally right. I wasn't even looking for anything sketchy. More like I was curious, you know. I'd heard all these stories, seen those videos on YouTube of people browsing the dark web, and I wanted to see what was out there. Harmless curiosity, right? Well, it started harmless. I was just scrolling through random forums, mostly stuff that didn't make any sense. A lot of the sites were broken or just filled with garbage. But then, one thing caught my attention. It was a really plain-looking site, all white background with just one line of text in the middle that read, "Buy sunlight, get what you've been missing." Now, I live in a place where it rains, like constantly. Seattle-level vibes, but worse. So, you can imagine my curiosity. The winters here feel like they last forever, and honestly, the idea of buying sunlight sounded ridiculous, but also tempting. I clicked on it. Obviously, the site was weirdly simple, like it was made in 1999 and never updated. There was no menu, no options, just a checkout page that said I could buy 10 days of sunlight for $500. I know. Who the hell pays $500 for sunlight? I almost clicked off, but I guess something in me wanted to see where this went. Maybe I thought it was a joke or some kind of gag product, like when people sell jars of fresh air. Still, I was intrigued. I had some extra cash saved up, and maybe I was just desperate after weeks of gloom. So, like an idiot, I entered my payment info. No confirmation page. No, thank you for your purchase. Just the same line of text that brought me there in the first place. Get what you've been missing. I was about to close my laptop, chalking it up to another deep web scam, when something strange happened. The room felt brighter. No, not just brighter, warmer. I looked up from my screen and swear to God, it was like a beam of sunlight was shining directly into my living room, and not the weak, cloudy kind you get after it rains. This was full-blown summer sun. I stood up, walked over to the window, but outside, still dark and rainy as ever. The light was coming from inside the house. That's when I noticed it wasn't just light. The air smelled fresher. You know how the first warm day after winter hits and everything smells like flowers and cut grass? It was like that, but indoors. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel it soaking into my skin, warming me up in the most comforting way. It felt peaceful. I'm not gonna lie, I loved it. The constant rain had me in a funk for months, and this light was like the antidote. I laid on the couch, soaking it all in. It was perfect. I kept thinking, maybe this is some weird new therapy tech. Maybe I stumbled onto some next-level relaxation tool or something. For the next few days, everything was great. Every time I logged into that site, the sunlight would appear, bathing my house in this soft, golden glow that made everything feel right. My mood was better. My sleep improved. Even my wife, who's usually kind of stressed out from work, seemed calmer, more at ease. I didn't tell her about the site. I mean, how do you even explain that? Hey honey, I bought sunlight off the deep web, and now our house is some sort of magical summer oasis. Yeah, no, but it didn't matter. We both felt the effects. She'd come home, and the moment she stepped inside, her whole vibe would change. She'd drop her bag, smile in a way that seemed almost too relaxed, and we'd sit in the living room, basking in that warm glow like a couple of sun-starved lizards. I guess I thought I'd just gotten lucky, like I'd found this crazy life hack no one knew about. Then, one evening, about a week in, things started to get off. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, just chilling in the light like usual, when my wife leaned over and asked, "Do you ever hear it?" I frowned. "Hear what?" "The hum," she said, tilting her head slightly, like she was trying to focus on something distant. "It's been there the whole time, but I can't figure out where it's coming from." I didn't know what she was talking about. "Nope, I don't hear anything." She shrugged, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We left it at that, but that's when I started paying more attention. That's when I realized she wasn't wrong. There was something. It wasn't loud, more like a faint vibration, a low hum that you couldn't really notice unless you were really listening for it. At first, I thought it might just be the house settling, or maybe some kind of weird electrical noise from the lights. But the more I focused on it, the more it felt alive, like a pulse. I decided not to mention it. I didn't want to freak her out, and honestly, I figured it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light, the warmth, it was starting to change. I just didn't know how much yet. So about a week after my wife mentioned the hum, things started to feel off. Not just a little off, like unsettlingly weird. It was subtle at first. I'd walk into the living room and feel like the sunlight was a little too bright, like it had dialed itself up a notch or two. You know how, when you stand too close to a bonfire, and you can't tell if it's comforting or dangerous. That's what it felt like. The warmth was almost suffocating at times, but still, I couldn't pull myself away from it. I noticed my wife was spending more time sitting directly in the sunlight too, like she'd just come home, drop everything, and plop down in the same spot on the couch without even saying a word. It became a routine. She'd sit there for hours, staring out into nothing, like she was in some kind of trance. I tried asking her about it a few times, but she just brushed me off with vague responses like, "It's nice to relax," or "It helps me clear my head." I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe she just needed to unwind. But then she started smiling. Not the usual, normal smile you give someone when you're happy. No, this was different. It was like her face was stuck in this unnerving half smile all the time. You know when someone smiles, but their eyes don't? That weird hollow look. Yeah, that. She'd smile at me like that, even when we weren't talking, like her face was frozen. I remember one night, I woke up around 2 a.m., and she wasn't in bed. At first, I thought maybe she'd gone to the bathroom or something, but after a few minutes, I started to feel that same unease creeping up my spine. I got up and wandered down the hall, and there she was, sitting in the living room, in the dark, the faint glow of the sunlight still lingering. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, facing the window. The thing is, there was no actual sunlight. It was 2 in the morning, pitch black outside, but it looked like she was basking in something I couldn't see. "Hey, you good?" I asked, trying to shake off the creeping dread that was building up in my chest. She didn't answer. She didn't even flinch, just kept sitting there, with that same vacant smile plastered on her face. I walked up to her, put a hand on her shoulder, and that's when she finally turned to look at me. But her eyes, they were wrong. Her pupils were dilated, like someone who had been sitting in the dark for too long. even though the room was bathed in this soft glow. She blinked slowly and whispered, "I can hear it." "Hear what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The hum," she said again, her voice hollow. "It's getting louder." I stood there for a moment, completely freaked out. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't hear anything, but the way she was acting, it was like she was tuning into something I couldn't even perceive. "We should go back to bed," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. I helped her up, and she followed me, still wearing that unnerving smile. When we got back to the bedroom, she fell asleep instantly, but I couldn't. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, things felt normal again, I guess, as normal as they could after a night like that. She didn't mention the hum, and I didn't push it. Maybe it was just a weird dream. Maybe she was stressed, and her mind was playing tricks on her. But the day after that, yeah, things got a lot worse. It started when I noticed the light. It wasn't just in the living room anymore. When I came downstairs for breakfast, there was a soft, golden glow spilling out of the kitchen too. And it wasn't like the light from the sun streaming through the windows. It was coming from the walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed to shimmer. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the room. I tried to shake it off, but it was like the house had taken on a life of its own. The air felt thicker, heavier, and I started noticing shadows where there shouldn't be any. It was like the light was bending around objects, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone, barely touching her food. The smile was gone, but something about her seemed off. Her skin looked pale, almost like she hadn't been outside in weeks, which was ridiculous because we'd been in the sunlight every day. I sat down across from her, trying to act like everything was fine, but I could feel this weird tension building between us. "You okay?" I asked, knowing full well the answer was probably no. She looked up at me slowly, her eyes locking onto mine in a way that made me feel like I was sinking into the floor. "I can't stop hearing it," she whispered. "The hum?" She nodded, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee mug. "It's everywhere now. It's in the walls." I didn't know what to say. My brain was screaming at me to get out, to leave the house and never come back, but I couldn't just leave her there. Something was happening to her, something I couldn't explain, and I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness. That night, I tried not to log back onto the website, but I couldn't resist. I wanted answers. When I opened it, the page was exactly the same as before. No new updates, no additional information. Just that same phrase, staring back at me from the screen. "Get what you've been missing." But as I stared at the screen, I noticed something strange in the reflection of my laptop. The room behind me was filled with light. Not just any light, but the same warm, golden light I'd been seeing all week. I turned around, and there it was, spilling out from every corner of the house, filling the room like some sort of living entity. That's when I realized it wasn't sunlight. It was something else entirely. After that night, everything got worse, like way worse. It's hard to even describe what it was like living in that house. It felt like reality had started to blur around the edges. The light, that golden glow I'd been so obsessed with, wasn't just a part of our lives anymore. It was alive. It had taken over. At first, I tried to ignore it, tried to act like it was just some bizarre side effect or whatever the deep web had pulled me into. But the more I ignored it, the stronger it got. The light followed me everywhere. I'd go into a room, turn off the lights, close the blinds, and still, it would creep in, seeping through the cracks in the doors, spilling out from behind the furniture, like it was trying to fill every inch of the house. My wife, she wasn't the same. I didn't know if she was even still my wife. Every day, she spent more time in the light, her behavior growing stranger by the hour. She'd just sit there, completely still, watching the walls like they were playing a movie only she could see. And every now and then, I'd catch her mouthing words, whispering things under her breath, things I couldn't make out. One night, I heard her talking in her sleep. Well, it sounded like talking at first, but when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't just words, it was numbers. She was repeating strings of numbers over and over again. I shook her gently, trying to wake her up, but she just kept going, whispering these long sequences like she was in a trance. I don't know why, but something about the numbers stuck with me. The next morning, I wrote them down as best I could remember. 7, 19, 34, 8. The sequence seemed random, but it nagged at me like I was missing something obvious. I tried searching for it online, but nothing came up. It felt like a dead end. By now, the light wasn't just limited to the house anymore. It was on her. She didn't seem to notice, but her skin had taken on this strange glow, like she was absorbing it. Whenever I touched her, it felt like I was touching something wrong. Her skin was cold, even though the light was always warm. She barely ate, barely slept, and the hum, it was everywhere. Even when I left the house, I could still hear it, like it had embedded itself into my mind. Then came the night I couldn't pretend anymore. I woke up at around 3 a.m., sweating, the room drenched in that damn golden light. I could hear it again, the hum, but this time it was loud, vibrating through the walls, like something was trying to claw its way inside. My heart was racing, but I forced myself out of bed and walked toward the living room. As I got closer, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like someone breathing. But it wasn't just breathing. It was off, like someone was struggling to pull air in, slow and deliberate, each breath deeper than the last. I stopped in the hallway, frozen, listening. The air felt thick, heavy with this electric tension. My legs were shaking, but I kept moving, inching forward, until I could see into the living room. That's when I saw her. My wife was standing in the middle of the room, her back to me, bathed in that same golden light. But she wasn't standing like a normal person. Her head was tilted to one side, her neck craned unnaturally far, like her body didn't understand how to hold itself up anymore. Her arms hung limp at her sides, fingers twitching slightly, and her skin, it was glowing, almost pulsing with light, like there was something underneath, something alive, pushing its way out. I tried to call her name, but my voice cracked and no sound came out. I just stood there, watching her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, slowly, she started to turn around. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. When she finally faced me, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't just her eyes. They were completely black, like voids, but her face was wrong too. Her features looked stretched, like someone had taken her skin and pulled it too tight over her skull. That smile, that same unnatural half smile she'd been wearing for days, was now so wide it looked like her lips were about to tear apart. "I found it," she whispered, her voice sounding distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside her. The source. It's here. I can see it now. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But she took a step forward, still smiling, her black eyes locked onto mine. "What are you talking about?" I managed to choke out, my throat dry. She tilted her head again, that same unnatural angle, and said, "It's been calling me, calling us. I can show you." I don't know what it was, panic, instinct, whatever, but I turned and ran. I bolted out of the house, not even thinking, just desperate to get away. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there, hunched over, staring back at my house, the windows glowing with that soft golden light. I wanted to call someone. I wanted to get help. But who do you even call for something like this? The police? And tell them what? That my wife was possessed by some weird sentient light I ordered off the deep web. I ended up driving to a motel on the edge of town and crashed there for the night. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those black, empty eyes staring back at me. I heard the hum. It was in my head now too, like it was following me. By the time the sun came up, I knew I had to go back. I couldn't leave her there, whatever was happening. I needed to figure this out, to end it. But as I drove back, my phone buzzed. A text. It was from her. Just 2 words. "Come home." When I pulled back into the driveway, the house looked different. The golden light wasn't just in the windows anymore. It seemed to be bleeding out of the walls, leaking from the cracks, casting long distorted shadows across the front yard. It was still early morning, but the light was stronger than ever, making everything outside look dim and washed out, like the world around the house was fading. I sat in the car for a minute, staring at the house, trying to convince myself to go inside. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "Come inside." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I had to see what was happening. I had to know if my wife was still her. I couldn't just leave her like this. So I got out of the car and walked up to the front door, my hand trembling as I turned the knob. The moment I stepped inside, it hit me. The smell. It wasn't fresh anymore. That sweet warm scent I'd loved so much had turned into something rotten, like old fruit left out in the sun too long. It was thick in the air, heavy and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. I gagged, but forced myself to keep going. The living room was worse than I'd imagined. The light was everywhere, not just filling the room, but writhing, shifting, twisting around the furniture like it was alive, like it had taken over the space completely. The walls were warping in places, bending inward slightly, as if the house itself was being pulled apart from the inside. It felt wrong. All of it felt wrong. And there she was. My wife was standing in the middle of the room again, facing the window. This time, though, she wasn't alone. There was something next to her, something barely visible, like a shadow, but not quite. It flickered in and out of sight, standing just behind her, towering over her like a black void in the shape of a person. No, not a person. It was taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle, like it was watching me with something more than just eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then slowly, my wife turned to face me again. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was blank, almost peaceful. Her eyes were still wrong, though, completely black, bottomless, like the pupils had swallowed the irises whole. But it wasn't just her eyes this time. Her skin had taken on this strange, almost translucent quality, as if the light was shining through her, like she was becoming part of it. "It's almost done," she said, her voice soft, calm. "What's almost done?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "The connection," she replied, stepping closer, the shadow moving with her. "It's been calling us, showing us what we've been missing. Don't you want to see it?" I backed away instinctively, shaking my head. "See what? What the hell is going on?" She stopped a few feet away from me, tilting her head in that strange, unnatural way again, and said, "It's not just light. It's so much more. You opened the door, and now it's coming through. It's been waiting for us, waiting to bring us to the source." I couldn't breathe. I felt like the air in the room had been sucked out, replaced by that horrible, oppressive hum that was now deafening. It was vibrating through the walls, through my bones, making my whole body feel like it was on the verge of collapsing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I didn't open any door." Her face softened, and for a moment, it almost looked like the woman I knew, the woman I married. But then she reached out and placed her hand on my chest, and I felt it, this cold, sharp sensation that wasn't right. Her fingers felt like ice, and the moment they touched me, I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. "You did," she whispered, "when you ordered it, when you brought the light into our home. It wasn't sunlight, it was the connection, and now we're part of it." I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. Her grip tightened, and I could feel the cold spreading through my chest, creeping into my veins, making my heart race even faster. My vision started to blur, the light around us warping, twisting, until it was all I could see. Then, suddenly, I was somewhere else. I was standing in a vast, empty space, surrounded by the same golden light. But here, it wasn't warm. It was cold, and it pressed in on me from every side, suffocating. In the distance, I could see shapes, figures, tall and thin, moving toward me, their bodies flickering in and out of existence, just like the shadow I'd seen in the living room. They were getting closer, the movements slow, deliberate. I could feel them watching me, their black, empty eyes fixed on me as they moved through the light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. Then, just as they were about to reach me, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was back in the living room. My wife was gone. The shadow was gone, but the light was still there, still pulsing softly, filling the room with that horrible warmth. I stood up, my whole body shaking, and looked around. The house felt empty, hollow, like it had been abandoned for years. The walls were warped, the furniture twisted, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, and as soon as I stepped into the yard, I noticed something. The light wasn't just in the house anymore. It was spreading. Slowly but surely, it was creeping out from the windows, the doors, seeping into the grass, into the trees, into the sky. It was infecting everything. I looked up, and there it was, the sun. But it wasn't the sun I knew. It was the same golden light, brighter than ever, hanging in the sky like a massive burning eye, watching everything, watching me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away from the light, away from that thing that had taken over my wife, my home, my life. But no matter how far I ran, the light was always there, following me, growing stronger with every step. I don't know what I've done. I don't know how to stop it. But whatever it is, it's coming. It's spreading. And I can't escape it. I didn't stop running until I hit the edge of the woods. My legs were burning, lungs on fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the light was still right behind me, creeping closer, like it was chasing me down. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could hear was that hum, louder than ever now, echoing in my head, pounding in my skull. It was like it was inside of me, growing with every second. I pulled out my phone, desperate for some kind of connection to the real world, but the screen was nothing but static. I tried to call someone, anyone, but the phone wouldn't work. Even the air around me felt strange, like the light was distorting everything. The trees were warping, bending toward me like they were being pulled by something unseen. The whole world felt off, like I was slipping away from reality. And then I saw it again. At the edge of the clearing, just barely visible through the trees, that same shadowy figure, the one I'd seen in the house, the one that had been standing beside my wife. Only now, it wasn't just flickering in and out of sight. It was solid, real, moving toward me with deliberate, slow steps. It towered above everything, its body stretching unnaturally tall, limbs too long, head twisted at an impossible angle. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I could feel it pulling at me, the same way the light had pulled at my wife. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get away, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, watching as the shadow got closer, closer, until it was just a few feet away. Then it stopped. The hum went silent. Everything around me went still. And that's when I heard it. A voice, deep and distorted, echoing in my mind like it was being transmitted from somewhere far away. You brought us through. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my mouth wouldn't move. The voice wasn't coming from the shadow. It was inside my head, filling every corner of my mind, drowning out everything else. You opened the connection. Now, you're part of it. The words sent a cold shock through my entire body. My head was spinning, my thoughts racing. The connection. That's what my wife had been talking about. That's what she'd been trying to tell me. Whatever I'd done, whatever I'd brought into our house, it wasn't just some strange light. It was something else, something far darker, something I couldn't understand. And it was here now. It had come through. I didn't mean to. I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper, shaking with terror. I didn't know. The shadow moved closer, leaning down until it was towering over me, its featureless face just inches from mine. The air around me felt heavy, like gravity itself was pushing down on me. My skin prickled with cold, and I felt like I was sinking into the ground, being pulled down by whatever this thing was. It doesn't matter, the voice said, louder now, almost deafening. You opened the door. There's no going back. The world around me seemed to shift, bending and warping like I was being pulled into some other dimension. The trees, the ground, everything was twisting, blurring into one chaotic swirl of color and light. My head was pounding, my vision fading. I could feel the light wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't comprehend. And then suddenly, everything stopped. I was back in my house, I blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The golden light was still there, still pulsing through the walls, but everything else felt quiet. The hum was gone. The air wasn't thick anymore. It was like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I saw her. My wife was standing in the living room again, but this time she looked normal. Her eyes weren't black anymore, and her skin wasn't glowing. She was just standing there, looking at me, her expression blank but familiar. I almost let out a sigh of relief, but something held me back. Something was wrong. I could feel it. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me, her face completely emotionless. Then, slowly, she smiled. That smile, the same unnerving, too wide smile that had haunted me for days. Her eyes darkened, just for a moment, and then she said, "It's too late." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? What's too late?" She didn't move, just kept smiling, her eyes fixed on mine. "We're part of it now, all of us. It's already spread." I looked around the room, panic rising in my throat. The light. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was spilling out through the windows, creeping into the yard, into the neighborhood, stretching farther than I could see. And in the distance, beyond the trees, beyond the town, I could see the sky changing, darkening, like the light was consuming everything. I ran to the window, my breath catching in my throat. The sun. It wasn't a sun anymore. It was just a massive, burning eye, hanging in the sky, watching, waiting. And all around it, the shadows were moving. Dozens of them, hundreds, flickering, shifting, stretching across the landscape, spreading like a virus. "We opened the connection," she whispered from behind me, her voice soft, but filled with something dark. "And now, it's everywhere." I turned to face her, but she was gone. The room was empty except for the light. The hum was back, louder than ever, vibrating through the walls, through my bones, making my head throb. And outside, the shadows were moving closer. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if there's a way to stop this. But if you're reading this, if you're seeing this, don't order the sunlight. Don't look for it. Don't try to find that website. Because once you open the door, once you let it in, there's no going back. It's too late for me. But maybe it's not too late for you.